My name
Malanga,
is
we're in Johannesburg, which has just had its first rain of spring as of yesterday. So it's certainly nothing like they've seen in the Western Cape, but it's nice to have a bit of rain up here.
We are giving you our warmth and the sunshine. I hope it's shining over there. My name is Nomalanga Sokela. I'm from eThekwini Municipality Economic Development Unit. I'm responsible for maritime industry development. I will be assisting in co-piloting the session with Dusty this afternoon. And I'm representing eThekwini Municipality because we're having a partnership with eThekwini Maritime Cluster. The cluster was established in 2008 as a strategic special purpose vehicle for partnerships with industry, maritime industry players, academic institutions, and other spheres of government. The main objective of the cluster is to implement programs and projects of strategic importance that are also assisting in unlocking the challenges that are faced within the maritime industry and the ports. The cluster is based on 4 pillars. Those pillars are ranging from enterprise development, marine manufacturing, aquaculture, skills development. The reason we are here today is under the pillar of skills development, which are focusing on partnership with academic institutions. We also work with Maritime High School, developing curriculum, but also assisting unemployed graduates with work readiness, getting ready for the work environment, but also finding them placement, either for internship or learnership, and where possible, they get opportunities for permanent placement. But we also run Maritime Youth Innovation Challenge. We also have a Maritime Career Expos, also exposing the youth, the teachers, and also the communities working in partnership with the port, running port tours with a view to also to promote maritime as a sector and also as a career of choice. We are here today focusing on the partnership with the UKZN, University of KwaZulu-Natal, where we also run projects that are focusing on creating body of knowledge using the academic space, addressing issues that are faced that we are facing within the port space and within the maritime industry. The eThekwini Maritime Cluster runs a series of webinars on quarterly basis, and today we are focusing on cyber security and information protection. I am here with me with Dusty, our esteemed doctor and admitted advocate of the High Court, a lecturer of the School of Maritime Law, and an acting director of the Unit of Maritime Studies. We have a long-term working relationship with the school. I'm also an alumni of the school. Before your time, Dusty, I studied maritime studies, but I'm glad to also coming back as a colleague to the faculty. The work has been emanating in a series of research that has been done by postgraduate students from a master's level and also from a PhD level. And today we're creating a platform to get insights and also to give a platform to share the products, the outcomes, but also with a view to also to promote the work that is coming from the universities to be able to be shared with the industry so that we can see how we could come up with innovation, latest research, and also addressing the issues facing the sector. I'm sure all of us, we are aware, I think about a year ago, we have had experience whereby the Port of Durban was attacked in terms of the cyber attack, and it affected the operations at the port. And we welcome our young minds and young energies coming with new insight into how we can innovatively and collectively addressing the issue that we are facing it within the maritime space. Without wasting much time, I would like to introduce Professor Donnelly, and would like to hand over to her so that she can introduce the speakers for today. Over to you, Dusty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nomalanga, and welcome to everyone who's joined us online today. We are also recording this webinar so that we can share it more widely and hopefully get this conversation started. I see people are trickling in, and hopefully a few more people will be able to join us as we edge into the lunch hour. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today and give a student the platform for once, or a former student. Matthew van Maasdijk is now a candidate legal practitioner at the law firm Clyde & Co. And he was a student at the Unit of Maritime Law and Maritime Studies. He has a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Pretoria, and his LLM in Maritime Law from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Matthew is the kind of student we all want as supervisors. He came to my attention early on, even before he joined the program, through his enthusiastic inquiries about the program, and his evident passion for the maritime sector was front and center from the beginning of my engagements with him. And it was a pleasure to supervise him. He really did take the bit between his teeth with this topic, and what he's presenting you today, I can assure you, is a small slice of the knowledge that he devoured in the year that he spent researching this issue and producing voluminous drafts for me to read. Matthew is going to present to you an industry snapshot of cyber risks facing the port sector in South Africa. And I do ask everyone here from industry to share this conversation and to ensure that we can get this issue onto the agenda. Once Matthew's finished talking and given his presentation, I'll ask you to hold questions, please, or pop them in the chat if you can't hold on to your questions. And we'll hear a short presentation from our second speaker today, who is Christopher McRoberts, and I'll introduce him to you when his talk commences. Matthew, are you ready with your PowerPoint and ready to kick off?
Hi, Dusty. Thanks. I just would perhaps need permission to share my screen. It does seem that the permission setting is not seeming to allow me to do so.
Okay, while we let our organizer sort that out, just allow the permission to share the screen. Can I ask everybody to pop in the chat just a contact email address and let us know where you're from? If we just take a minute or two to introduce ourselves via the chat. I'll also put my details there, and if anyone is interested in following up with me about today's presentation, you're welcome to contact me on my email address. All right, I'm going to mute myself and just check that we've got a permission set up. Sorry, we seem to be struggling. If we could just give us a few more minutes to sort this out. Sorry, everybody, for the inconvenience. Nomalanga, are you able to reach Nomzebo? I can't find out from him if he's managed to solve the screen share problem.
That's the I'm reaching for him. I'm on him on the phone just now.
Thanks.
Sorry, Darcy, I do see that the option has appeared on my screen, so I'll just give it a shot and see if it does come through.
Awesome. Always the first rule of cyber. try again until by luck you figure it out and something comes right. Fingers crossed.
Okay. I'm getting hold of him about. He's saying he's opened the access to everyone to share. Please try again, Matthew. Thank you.
Sure. Just are you able
There
to
we
see my
go.
screen there?
Yes, we are.
Great.
Just
Thank you. Thank
put
you.
it in
Great.
presentation mode. Super. So thank you so much. Sorry again, everybody, for the inconvenience and delay. But I see it has allowed a few more people time to join. Matthew, without further ado, over to you.
No, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much for the very warm welcome. I know you did say that in the beginning about cybersecurity being a lot more that one can chew, and that definitely was the case when I started off. I think I even planned a lovely holiday to Germany at the end of the year, thinking I would finish well within the bounds. Actually, didn't turn out that way. I think Dusty will recall the amount of times, or I think during the course of my studies or during the course of my dissertation, I think I changed topics about or try to narrow it down about 4 times, 3 times, and that just gives you sort of a sense as to how broad and how interesting the field of cybersecurity is, and specifically from a maritime perspective. And I think the first time that I actually came across the topic was at a webinar in the second year of my studies. A certain Julian Clark from INTS, and well, he was working there at the time, and he actually presented on it, and it just sparked my interest and seemed like something that I would like to embark on. And I'm grateful that I did embark on that challenge, and it definitely was a challenge. And so hopefully, I'm hoping today to give you a sort of a snapshot as to what entails and what is required of all of us as practitioners within the maritime field and the legal field at large. And I mean, from a South African perspective, we all know in 2021, TMPA, Transnet Ports Authority, suffered a cyber attack. And I mean, for the impacts and flow and effects from that further compounded efficiency woes that we unfortunately are facing within our ports, South African ports. And it is a consideration that needs to be taken account of, being cyber mindful and implementing cyber policies, procedures, and hygiene practices in place. And specifically at a global level, if you look at Europe, if you look at the USA, they've started to take those steps. The USA specifically, there was a professor that I was in conversation with quite frequently during my studies, and both based in the USA and then also at the ports of Rotterdam, Frans van Zulen. And it just gave you an insight as to how these, well, the transition to the smart ports goes hand in hand with implementing adequate procedures and policies. And I mean, from a South African point of view, just generally, it would be something that we need to take account of, not so much out of choice, but out of necessity as we transition towards the smart port era. And just to give you a statistic is to show you or the sense of urgency and probably, for the lack of a better word, sense of fear that's starting to creep in due to inadequate preparedness in comparison to your more critical or to other critical infrastructure industries such as aviation. I mean, a statistic that I came across demonstrated that there was 900% increase in cybersecurity breaches on operational technology in 2021 alone, which shows you the gravity and as it gives you a glimpse as to how pressing the issue is becoming. And I mean, the issue as well, account needs to be taken of this as the integration and of information technology and operational technology systems further progresses and speeds up, and this ties hand in hand with your smart boards. So just trying to start this presentation. Sorry, I'm not the most technical savvy. So, I mean, just on that slide there, that just gives you a glimpse as to certain statistics that are taken from your magazine articles. And I'm sure Chris will be able to elaborate further on your ransomware and your forms of attacks. And I mean, aside from at a broader and a global level, it wasn't, Transnet was probably from the people that I conversed with at the time, it flowed on from external factors that come into play. So could have been politically motivated, but that obviously is something that wouldn't be disclosed. But it just shows you that there are various factors that need to be taken account of within the cybersecurity context, and the complexity involved from a port and shipping perspective is obviously the variety of shareholders and complex systems that you have, and it provides the perfect breeding ground and vector field within which to launch an attack. And I mean, if you take, moving away from cybersecurity, if you take the incidents of the Suez Canal with the Ever Given, I mean, that one of the first possibilities that was cited as the reason for the grounding of the vessel was a cyber attack, which obviously affecting its navigational systems. And I mean, that there gives you a sort of, although it was deemed not to be cyber related, that gives you a glimpse as to the potential nature of attack and affects ramifications, economic ramifications that it can have globally at a global level, because it's given the importance of trade. And I mean, even from a South African context, if you tie that in with our ports inefficiencies and the importance of ports to our economy, and if you now have an attack that extends beyond a 2-day period into a 2-week or even a downtime that lasts for over a month, you can just start to gain sort of an understanding as to the severe ramifications that will have on the country's economy. So even from a foreign perspective, sorry, just going back, there were major attacks that I'm sure one specific major attack that comes into mind on critical infrastructure was your Colonial Pipeline attack carried out in the United States. And just off the top of my head, I stand to correction. I think that was obviously was put down to being a potentially politically motivated attack. But I mean, even then, you could have cyber threat actors that are that don't have such intentions. I mean, there was even an instance that I came across with an oil rig off the coast of West Africa that these 13-year-old teenagers were able to hack into the systems of the oil rig as just a pastime as a pastime event. And so I mean, that just shows you that even individuals that it just shows you that, I mean, cyber is something that needs to be taken into account within it's not just limited to a specific group, but extends beyond. I mean, it could be individuals that are affiliated with a certain state, or it could be malicious employees within, say, for example, an entity such as Transnet who, out of spite, decide to infect IT or OT systems with malicious software, malware. So I'm not too sure if any of you are or had personal experiences from the TMPA attack and are just open to the floor for discussion. If anyone has an experience to share in that regard. No one. Okay,
I'm not
so
seeing any hands, but I think if we can take some questions at the end.
okay, great. No, sorry. I thought I would just. So just moving on and staying with the forms of attack. One during my research, one, although there hasn't been a incident of this nature as of yet, Stuxnet is a prime example of the malicious nature that cyber breaches or cyber attacks can take on. And I mean, even if you consider the various types of vessels that you have within the maritime industry, your LNG and your LPG vessels, and this goes back into the example that I gave previously. Now, with the Ever Given, if you take an LNG or LPG vessel, and you obviously hack into your critical systems, that then could even turn it into a device that could be used for terrorist means or for politically motivated attacks. And I mean, that just shows you the extent that cyber breaches could take on. And I think the mistake that people make is that they kind of downplay the gravity and serious nature that cyber breach and cybersecurity in general. And it's a consideration that it's as I said at the outset, with your advancement towards a more technologically inclined port environment, it's something that needs to seriously be considered. Um, and just moving forward. So yeah, so just going forward and just going also back to the outset where I gave the examples of the EU and the US now starting to take a standpoint and to recognize the gravity and severity of it, and how your advancement and transition to a more technologically inclined environment, sports environment, goes hand in hand with ensuring that the correct procedures and protocols are in place. And at the same time, the maritime industry at large and historically has been a industry that has only taken action upon a serious event. I mean, it also goes hand in hand with your 9/11 attacks with the ISPS code. That's a prime example that shows you that it is a industry that changes over time, but it only changes subsequent to a severe or catastrophic event, unfortunately. And in a cybersecurity context, it's not something that can be similarly applied. We can't just wait until um, a major event occurs for us to take cognizance of the gravity and severity of it, and then only subsequent to which, or only then, do we take heed and implement the necessary procedures and protocols. It needs to be done now. We need to act in a proactive manner. And I mean, I think this is where the EU and the USA specifically have started to lay the groundworks, not just within your maritime sector, but your other critical infrastructure sectors and from a private means as well. And it's from a South African context, it's something that we need to similarly apply and take heed of and learn. And obviously, your legislative means and procedures would differ according to different jurisdictions. But I think they will specifically, if I use the example, the NIS directive from a European perspective, that there serves as a good framework or groundwork, which then we could obviously adapt according to our own legislative means, being the Cyber Crimes Act. Just moving forward. Sorry. So from the IMO, International Maritime Organization perspective, they obviously have now started to take steps towards, or they've started to recognize that cybersecurity is something that needs to be integrated into existing regulatory means and procedures. And to this end, they obviously the IMO have started to publish guidelines in conjunction with industry groups such as the IAPH. And this is actually during my time with the research I conducted, I came across Frans van Zulen, who had contributed quite significantly to the IAPH guidelines. But the only issue is that whilst the guidelines provide a decent framework from which to work from, they are not mandatory. And the one thing that one thing that is quite well recognized within from what I gained from the conversations with these industry experts is that, again, cognizance is only taken subsequent to a major event, or once someone has obviously suffered personally from a cyber breach. Only then do people realize, and cyber resiliency goes hand in hand with cyber awareness. And I think that's where, I mean, even Dusty will probably be testament to that, is that the focus of my study towards the human elements is probably one of the most critical factors. Because I mean, a lot of these private organizations and these port, or from a port perspective, they place a significant amount of emphasis on your technological defense means. They don't actually focus on your human element. And that your technological, your firewalls and your endpoint protection and the likes goes hand in hand with investing in your personnel. Because I mean, you can spend significant amounts of money on your technological defense, but if you neglect your human factor, that then could serve as the Trojan horse into systems. So it is something, and it needs to be developed in conjunction with your technological means. So that should come up on the next slide. It does. So obviously the focus, the central point of my research with the ISPS code, although it deals with and caters for your physical threats and was obviously promulgated of subsequent to the 9/11 attacks and the realization that vessels like the planes that were used on the Twin Towers could be used as a means or vector for launching a terrorist attack on your critical port infrastructure. And similarly, that whilst it was promulgated at a time when cybersecurity, or cyber for that matter, was not as much of an issue as it's fast becoming now, it does lay the framework and groundwork from which could be developed and adapted in the interim towards a cyber context until such a time that new legislative means are promulgated that are able to, or specifically designed with cybersecurity in mind. And case in point, if you had your port facility security plans and your port facility security assessments that are provided for in terms of the code, those then also from a human perspective focus on training and development of your human personnel. And there are already certain excerpts from that could be adapted to a cyber context and apply, and should actually be, well, I know from American perspective, they have already put plans in place, or it's promulgated in terms of the Maritime Transportation Act, and that they've already released certain supplementary protocols to obviously now implement your to take cyber into consideration. And there has been debate at the IMO, at an IMO level, but unfortunately a lot of it didn't gain the adequate support in order to effect those changes, although there have been voluntary guidelines that have been published. But at the same time, the voluntary nature of such guidelines is a sort of a hindrance to countries implementing those into their own domestic legislation. And the whole point of cybersecurity is being proactive and implementing those procedures into your own domestic legislation in order to ensure that when an attack does arise or breach occurs, you're able to react efficiently and in a proactive manner. So that then also just speaks to what I've just mentioned now in terms of focusing on the human factor and just some of the steps and that have been taken at a foreign level. And it is something that from a South African point of view, we need to consider as well. I mean, presently, sorry, we don't have any legislation from a maritime perspective specifically that incorporates or takes heed of cyber or cybersecurity for that matter. And it is quite surprising considering that, I mean, Transnet suffered an attack 2 years ago, and there still is not much talk, or from what I realized, there's not much talk towards taking the steps of implementing cybersecurity procedures and protocols. And it is something that will become more frequent, and it is something that that Transnet will need to take heed of and start implementing into their own corporate governance structures, but also at a legislative context at large. So that briefly, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to chat to everyone about today. And I thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the EMC for granting me the opportunity to carry out a study in this regard, and for Dusty for tolerating with the numerous drafts and for patience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Really, really interesting presentation. And I think there'll be questions from the audience later about what models we might consider in South Africa. The key takeaway, I think, from your presentation being that there's a gap currently in our legislation and policy. We need to think carefully about how we fill that gap. It's my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker, who has very kindly given his time to join us today, and his expertise, because our speaker is Christopher McRoberts. He's a partner in the law firm of Clyde & Co., and he is a litigator and specialist in cyber risks and data protection. And so he works across a range of industries, including financial lines insurance, professional indemnity and directors liability. And Chris, I'm not sure to what extent you've had engagements with the maritime sector, but I'm sure based on Matthew's talk and the trends that we're seeing in the sector, that you might well find yourself engaging more with maritime clients in the future. So thank you very, very much, Chris. And I'm going to hand over to you for your talk, which I think we build as some cyber do's and don'ts.
Dusty, thanks very much for the kind introduction and for the opportunity. And good afternoon to everyone who's listening. I hope that you can see the presentation on your screens. As Dusty said, my focus is on cybersecurity, and I work as part of Clyde & Co.'s one cybersecurity team. We're a multi-jurisdictional global cyber response team, and we assist clients with recovering from, preparing for, and remediating cyber incidents when they happen. So Dusty, in answer to your question, have we seen action in the maritime space? Definitely we have. Some of the biggest and most disruptive cyber incidents in the world have affected clients in the maritime area. And Clyde & Co. as a law firm traditionally has a very deep client base in the marine and shipping sector. So it's certainly something that we're familiar with. I should just caveat that by saying that I'm not a maritime or transportation expert. That's why Matthew was giving his speech first. But I'm just going to talk you through a couple of key points to understand. I know from looking at the responses in the chat earlier that there are a number of lawyers in the audience, so I'm not going to labor the points around legislation. I'm sure that most of you will be broadly familiar with the legislative framework. But what I'd like to touch on are a couple of practical points around where we're at the moment in South Africa in terms of enforcement and what the information regulator is doing at the moment. And then to talk really about readiness tips and how to deal with a cyber incident when it happens, because cybercrime is prolific. It's prolific not only in South Africa, but across the world. And cyber criminals don't think too hard about who their victims are before taking them. In the ports and maritime sector, there are some particularly high value and lucrative targets when we're talking about ransomware attacks. And I will give a couple of examples of where we've seen those kind of attacks executed successfully. But let's start closer to home. And I'm just going to walk you through the legislative framework. By now, I'm sure all of you will be familiar with the Protection of Personal Information Act, or POPIA for short. It is South Africa's main instrument of data protection, data privacy legislation, and it sets out 8 conditions of lawful processing which must be complied with. And that applies to both public sector and private sector entities. An important point to make about POPIA, which I think is not always generally understood, is that POPIA differs from legislation in other jurisdictions, like the GDPR, for example, or the UK Data Protection Act, in that POPIA protects the personal information of both natural and juristic persons. So it applies not only to individuals like you and me, but also to the personal information of companies and entities. So in that sense, it casts the net wider on protection of personal information than many comparable pieces of legislation elsewhere. And then the complementary piece of legislation, which is more recent on our statute books, is the Cybercrimes Act, which creates offences and penalties in respect of cybercrimes. It criminalizes the creation and distribution of harmful messages. It creates offences such as cyberbullying. And it also specifically creates offences relating to certain types of cybercrime, like cyber extortion and cyber terrorism. So these are, if you like, some of the new age forms of cybercrime, which Matthew was talking about. And fortunately, the Cybercrimes Act is starting to get a grip on creating a criminal legislative framework for how we deal with those. We're certainly further down the track in terms of enforcement under POPIA than we are under the Cybercrimes Act at the moment. The main probably gap with the Cybercrimes Act at this stage is that the SAPS is required to set up a dedicated reporting channel for cybercrimes, and that is not yet up and running. So we're hoping that in the next year or so we will see that, which will then make policing and enforcement under the Cybercrimes Act much more effective. But as matters stand, one of the biggest challenges that we have as lawyers in the cyber and data privacy space is that the reporting of cybercrimes can be very cumbersome, and the investigating and prosecutorial capacity in South Africa is presently very, very limited. That said, we have seen examples of where cybercrime syndicates have been picked up and prosecuted in South Africa. There was recently an example of a multi-jurisdictional romance scam, which was being operated out of South Africa, where the South African police, in conjunction with the FBI, cornered and arrested the perpetrators of that scam, and they are now facing extradition to the United States. So there are some promising developments in terms of law enforcement. And then just this graphic talks you briefly through the process of reporting a security compromise under POPIA and specifically Section 22. I promise this is the last specific reference I'm going to make to a section of an act, but it is important to understand it because Section 22 is the trigger point for reporting a security compromise, which has arisen. Security compromise is the term that is used in POPIA, but basically it means if you have suffered a data breach, if there has been an inadvertent disclosure of personal information, if there has been a ransomware attack, or if your data has been encrypted, and that involves personal information, then it is likely going to be reportable under Section 22. And this arrow over here gives you the process in terms of how one makes an assessment as to whether reporting ought to take place, and then how that reporting needs to be made. So again, I think everyone understands the information regulator has been set up to police and oversee POPIA compliance and also compliance with the Promotion of Access to Information Act. But what many people don't appreciate is that once Section 22 is triggered, it involves a dual reporting requirement. You both have to notify the regulator and data subjects, and that needs to take place as soon as reasonably possible. So I'm not going to go into great detail on this process, but just so that you understand, once POPIA is triggered, it does give rise to some important reporting obligations. And if there is any kind of cyber incident, we would certainly advise that this be considered and that advice be taken. And then just the last point around the role players. In terms of enforcement, we have the information regulator, which I've already mentioned, and that is made up of a chairperson and a committee under Advocate Pansy Klakula. And then more recently, we have an enforcement committee, which is established specifically to deal with enforcement matters under Helen Fourie, SC. And the enforcement committee has recently started to flex its muscles. You may have read about a fine of 5 million rand imposed on the Department of Justice in early July relating to a breach that took place last year. And then in the last month, there was an enforcement notice issued to Dis-Chem pharmacies in relation to aspects of compliance following a data breach. So the wheels are certainly starting to turn around enforcement of POPIA. We're often asked how the regulator becomes aware of non-compliance, and there are typically three routes. The first is self-reporting under Section 22, which is where a compromise is reported. There can also be complaints by members of the public. So if they feel that their data has not been processed correctly, they can make a complaint. Or the regulator can open an investigation of its own initiative. So there are many different ways in which the regulator can become aware of non-compliance and take action. So when it comes to cybersecurity in South Africa, what is going on? I've already mentioned that the regulator has started to use its enforcement powers, and we think that that is going to ramp up. So for those of you who are in positions of responsibility within your organizations, it's important to understand that the regulator is going to start showing its teeth, and so POPIA compliance is very important. At a board level, we say that cybersecurity is a director's concern. Many companies tend to segregate their functions, and particularly IT functions, but it is certainly a board level risk. And when we speak about D&O risks, those are directors and officers liability risks, where there may be serious risks of legal liability in the event of a major data breach or incident. What we're certainly seeing in South Africa are more sophisticated, large-scale cyber attacks. South Africa is an interesting place in which to carry out cybercrime because we have a relatively sophisticated private sector and we have some very large public sector entities in the form of our parastatals. So for cyber criminals, South Africa is an attractive test bed for certain cybercrime techniques. And we have seen several attacks, and I would be so bold as to say that the Transnet port attack and disruption that took place in 2021 was one of those, where we see attack techniques being trialed against South African targets, which are then later replicated elsewhere. We at Clyde & Co have certainly seen that with some of our clients in the private sector and in relation to healthcare and retail sector clients. We have seen ransomware attacks executed against them in South Africa, which have then gone on to be copied and duplicated in places like the United States and Europe. So I think because South Africa is in the early stages of developing an enforcement and a deterrence framework for cybercrime, it means that there is actually quite a lot of cybercrime that goes on here almost on this kind of pilot or test basis. And then just touching briefly on artificial intelligence, we say that it is both a good and a bad thing when it comes to cybercrime. It's a good thing in that it hardens defenses and it adds an additional layer to a cybersecurity posture, and threat detection becomes easier if you have artificial intelligence on your side. But equally, we have seen incidents this year in ransomware negotiations where artificial intelligence tools are used to carry on dialogues with victims of ransomware attacks. And those dialogues and the phishing attempts that are used to initiate them are much more realistic and lifelike because of the use of AI tools. So where in the past, one might be able to pick up a cybercrime attempt because the language that was used was unusual or poor or ungrammatical, AI now makes it much easier for non-English speakers to carry out cybercrime. So we think that there is good and bad, but on balance, my opinion, for what it's worth, is that it is a good thing in the fight against cybercrime. Just touching briefly on a couple of sort of maritime sector incidents. Matthew has spoken about the ransomware attack that the Transnet organization experienced. You may also be aware of several other big port-related incidents. And just recently, in the middle of this year, the Japanese port of Nagoya was disrupted by a cyber attack. That took its terminals and port operations offline for 2 days. I believe that there was no payment made after that attack, but it does give you an idea of the disruptive effect of this, not only on the port itself, but also on supply chains. And using the Transnet example, where Transnet declared force majeure as a result of the cyber attack, that of course has huge knock-on effects right down the supply chain, and it causes a cascading effect in terms of force majeure in turn being declared by users of the port. So the legal ramifications are significant. And then just to say that one of the largest and most well-known cyber attacks of the last decade affected the Maersk shipping line several years ago, when almost all of their port terminals were knocked out in consequence of the NotPetya attack, which was a state-sponsored cyber attack on Ukraine. It was intended on Ukrainian computer systems by the Russian Federation, and one of the spillover victims of that attack was Maersk shipping lines, with, again, huge disruptions to its operations. So that gives you an idea of the kind of spillover effects in the cybersphere of geopolitics, and that is certainly still a hot topic given what is going on between Russia and Ukraine. It is also a known fact at the moment that when it comes to grain shipments moving out of the Black Sea and the activities of those ports, there is a huge amount of both attempted cyber attacks and cyber deterrence going on at the moment, far more than is reported. So this really is a very hot area when it comes to cybersecurity. And then just wrapping up, Dusty, I know that I'm sort of waffling on a bit, so I'm going to wrap it up. These are just a few tips that we like to share with our clients around readiness, response, and recovery when it comes to cybersecurity. We always advise our clients to get to know the incident response team before an incident happens. Many of you may be aware that it is possible to purchase cyber insurance to combat these kind of threats, and that is where much of our work at Clyde & Co comes from. And cyber insurers typically have incident response teams which are on standby all the time in order to deal with an incident. And it's certainly worth getting to know them as you would get to know emergency service providers by having a set of their numbers on your fridge. It's the same kind of idea. It's important if a cyber attack happens not to panic about it. Breaches are extremely stressful, and it's important to manage internal and external communications very closely. And what you don't want is to have employees who are uncertain or unsettled leaking information to outsiders, because it just creates a compounding problem in terms of how all of that feedback needs to be managed. It's important to make sure that your service providers and outsourced service providers especially have resilient cybersecurity measures. We are seeing a lot of cyber vulnerabilities and attacks at the moment where access is gained to an organization through an outsourced service provider, which has weak password security or weak firewalls, and that then creates an entry point into the main organization with its own legal liability concerns. So in your contracts and in your dealings with service providers, it's important to consider cybersecurity. Preparation makes all the difference, and it's important to run preparedness drills in an organization for how to deal with a cyber attack. And part of the work that we do at Clyde & Co is to run those readiness assessments and what we call tabletop simulations. Probably the single most important tip you will hear from this presentation is that you should not engage or try to negotiate with threat actors or cyber criminals without seeking external assistance. Some of the worst instances we've seen of cyber crimes going bad and leading to detrimental outcomes is where clients try to negotiate, or where an individual in the IT department thinks that they can sort the problem out without referring it. And that then creates a dangerous escalation pattern, which may result in huge damage to data and to IT infrastructure. So please don't try to be a hero. And then we always say to our clients who are victims of cybercrime that it's important to portray in how you communicate that you're doing the right thing, that you're putting customers and stakeholders first, and that you're being a responsible corporate citizen. And if you are seen to do the right thing, and if you're acting in that way, it is very difficult to be criticized later by a regulator for not making responsible decisions, for not taking the public into your confidence. But there is a very important balancing act in terms of how much can be communicated, because we know that cyber criminals monitor communications that come out of companies, and they often use that as a negotiating technique. So one can't say too much about the extent of or the severity of a cyber incident, but it is important to manage communication and to keep stakeholders informed of what has happened. Dusty, I'm going to stop there. We have a couple more slides, but I don't think there's time for them now. And what I will do is I will share this presentation with you so that you can distribute it if you like after the webinar. But otherwise, I'm happy to move to Q&A.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Chris. That was oops.
You
Technical
you
problems
muted,
continue.
Dusty. All right.
I am. Thanks, Chris. I was on mute there, telling you that that was an absolutely fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. Really insightful. And what I valued was the roundup at the end, just with that distilled wisdom from having steered people through countless crises. One finds that invaluable. So thank you very much for sharing some cyber tips with us today. I am going to remind everybody that we really do want to have some discussion before everyone hops back to the office. And that if you wouldn't mind, if you joined us a little after 1 o'clock, pop into the chat and put your name down and let us know where you're from. We have a lot of lawyers here today, but several people joined us after 1. So if we could just take a minute to pop some names and emails if you're happy to share details, or just your name and where you're from. If you have a question, you're welcome to raise your hand and I'll moderate the discussion and call on you to ask the question. You should be able to unmute yourself. If you're shy, you're welcome to pop your question in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that as well. I want to kick off with my own question, which can either be to you or to Matthew. Perhaps I'll give you each a chance to respond. I think it was critical for me that you pointed to section 22 of POPIA, and I'm pleased to hear you again flying the flag for something I think people are unaware of, which is that personal information in this country extends to the information of juristic persons under POPIA. So it's got a potentially much wider ambit. But of course, the information regulator's mandate is exclusively in relation to personal information breaches. And so I wanted to ask if anyone in the audience, or if you and Matthew had some thoughts on information sharing generally. This is a really strong theme in the IAPH guidelines and in the NIST cybersecurity frameworks. And it doesn't seem to be an area in which we have developed any formal frameworks in this country in terms of port sector, cybersecurity, threats, incident information sharing. So any thoughts on that? Perhaps to Matthew first. I know you touched on this a little in your thesis. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I can do. I know it is actually one area that I try to investigate firstly, was information sharing, because of obviously the value in that. And I know from a USA perspective, a European perspective, they're trying to model it on the USA. They have something called MT-ISACs, or the actual acronym name actually slips to the top of my head, but I do know that they've seen the value in this, and they've started to set up these information sharing centers that so the whole ideology behind it is these private entities obviously share information to the central entity essentially, who then distributes it to other port sector stakeholders. Because obviously, if you look at the port environment, it's not just one entity. It's made up of a variety of private and public entities and organizations. So it is a collaborative effort. But the only issue and sort of stumbling block to this is that a lot of people or a lot of the entities are quite reserved with sharing information. Obviously, because I mean, at the same time, if you are a private entity and you've been hacked, you don't necessarily want to publicly make that information available because it affects your clientele basis and potential investment. So it is the variety of different factors that have ramifications on information sharing, but it has been cited as something that is well pivotal in the obviously in terms of cyber resiliency, but there are various considerations and factors that external and internal that need to be taken account in this regard, and that is something that I obviously came across during the research. But I'm sure yeah, I don't know if Chris has anything to add on that.
Yeah, Matthew, what I'd say from our experience, Dusty, in terms of what the regulator looks for when it comes to information sharing, as between entities, they're looking for policies or agreements that are in place to regulate the sharing of that information. And they're regarded as a shortcoming if there isn't some agreement which justifies the sharing or the transfer. And if it's going extraterritorial, if it's going outside South Africa, then one needs to look at whether there is some level of equivalence in the data protection framework of the recipient country. One of the challenges of POPIA is that it allows for a list of kind of competent jurisdictions to be published under the Act. But to the best of my knowledge, I think there are only 1 or 2 countries that have been included there, and it hasn't been updated for several years. So one then needs to actually seek the consent of the regulator to do that kind of transfer on a preemptive basis. And I think many companies overlook that. So it's something to consider, but at the very least, there should be a documented process for how that sharing takes place.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and I think that ties into what Matthew was talking about earlier, that for those port sector, for ports and port sector organizations covered by ISPS, the same thing would apply in terms of their port sector security plan. I was thinking more along the lines of we have got a national computer security incident response team. We've got a cyber hub. It has a website at least, but that's as little interaction as I've had with it. And we certainly don't have a sector specific sort of formal body like Matthew's talking about, which is where they've gone in the US and the EU. So I think that would be something for those of you here from the maritime sector who might want to comment or take the discussion offline. That's something that we need to put on the table when we're conversing around cybersecurity, is specific maritime sector body that can focus on cyber risks in the sector and how we address them as a collective. I'm not seeing any hands in the chat, and I just want to remind everybody to pop their details in the chat. If there are any questions, you can put them down there. Somebody's unmuted. Do they want to ask a question? Londiwe? Just muted Londiwe. I think she may have accidentally unmuted. Yeah, checking the chat, nothing's coming through. Question for Chris. There we go. Okay, so this is from Ridwan Hafaji. I think I saw Ridwan was involved in IT. So are we seeing cyber attacks in SA exploiting basic cyber controls like weak password settings, outdated systems, no monitoring, rather than more sophisticated tactics? Chris?
Yeah. It's a very good question, Ridwan. I would say the majority of cyber attacks that we see do exploit those basic weaknesses. So weak passwords or outdated passwords. We often see administrator passwords which haven't been changed or updated. I'm dealing with an incident at the moment where an administrator password was compromised that was 17 years old. And so we see brute forcing attempts on passwords to crack them. That's increasingly possible using the kind of AI tools that I spoke about. A big vulnerability that's frequently exploited is also failure to patch and update firewalls, for example, or day zero vulnerabilities. So where on our cloud platform, for example, there has been a security release or a day zero vulnerability identified, if that is then quickly used by cyber criminals to target an organization, it can give them access. And then kind of the fourth area of frequent exploit or exploitation is those outsourced service providers that I spoke about. So as an enterprise, you can have a particularly strong security posture, but if somebody has access to your network and is providing services, it almost creates a backdoor that can be exploited. So we see all of those things, but equally, we do see more sophisticated techniques. And I would venture to guess that if there is a specific attack contemplated against a port target, we may then see more sophisticated tactics if disruption of the port is the objective. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, it does. Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I think just to comment on that, from what I've read online, even the hack on the Colonial pipeline in America, which disrupted oil supplies up to the East Coast for several days, was a weak password on the VPN. So no one is immune to these sort of vectors. I still don't see any hands, but I'm hoping that someone will chip into the discussion here. That's possibly from the port sector. No offense to the lawyers present, but I am wondering if the cyber threat will escalate as we move towards fully digital document exchange in the maritime sector. We've seen, South Africa's talking about acceding to the FAL convention and moving forward in terms of the global push for a maritime single window for documents exchange when vessels call at ports. How does that, you mentioned earlier cloud platforms as an area of vulnerability. How prepared are we for navigating this new environment where we might have to interact on an insecure platform? What can we do to protect our organization from those threats?
Dusty, I would say there are a couple of must-haves when it comes to getting the right framework in place. One is multi-layered security. So the most effective security posture involves many different layers of cybersecurity. So you would have endpoint protection, you would have a robust firewall, you would have some kind of threat monitoring tool, and all of those come at a cost, but they are an investment in cybersecurity. The other would be that when you're looking at cloud platforms particularly, or VPNs, multi-factor authentication is the single greatest deterrent to cybercrime and credential theft. So using an authenticator app in order to log in and generate credentials is probably the most single effective tool, I would say.
Super, thanks. I think really, really helpful practical tips. So I think we'll wrap it up there. We've reached the end of the hour, and it's been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank our guests today, Matthew van Maasdijk, candidate legal practitioner, now left the ivory tower and enjoying life in the busy lanes of legal practice, and Chris McRoberts, both from Cloud & Co. Thank you so much to both of you for your time. I know from experience how busy it is in practice, and we really value you taking time out to talk to us today. I just want to wrap up with a word of thanks in closing again to the eThekwini Maritime Cluster. I see Nomalanga has her hand up. Would you want to chip in here, Nomalanga, before I thank the cluster and close off?
After it's just an additional request that everyone who's online just to open their cameras so that we take a group picture, and then we would like to keep it as our stakeholders, but also we have you on the record. Thank you, Dusty.
Super. Yeah, let's do that. That would be wonderful. Thanks. Pop your cameras on if you're not shy, and don't forget. Chris did offer to share his presentation, and if you'd like to receive it, please do pop your contact details in the chat so that we can share that with you after today's webinar. Unfortunately, the webinar registration function set up on Teams by Nsebo hasn't reliably captured everyone's details. So if you would like Chris's presentation, please do share those with me in the chat. Will you be doing the photographic honors, or is who's going to take the screenshot here?
I'm taking the screenshots. Thank
Awesome.
you so much, colleagues. Over to you, Dusty.
Thanks, Nomalanga. That's lovely. I hope we can share this presentation more widely, not just to get out the word about the importance of having a cybersecurity conversation in our industry, but also to get out the word about how much we value stakeholder support from industry partners and organizations like eThekwini Maritime Cluster, supported by the eThekwini municipality, represented here today by Nomalanga. And I know that colleagues from EMC are on the meeting. So from me, a personal thank you for your support of our students. It's invaluable at many levels. You provided a scholarship support, which I know Matthew will attest to as being a real game changer. It allows students to buy textbooks, it allows them to travel, it allows them to focus on their studies and buy food to eat. But other ways in which industry support is critical for what we do at the university is just engaging on topics of relevance. And Matthew mentioned how welcoming industry experts had been and how many conversations he had had with people nationally and internationally. And we're a friendly sector in maritime, but it is really valuable to us. So please do reach out and let's engage about other areas of research where our students can be connected to topics that are really meaningful to the industry and to our joint concern. So thanks EMC for your continued support of the academic initiative in the maritime space. And thanks very much to everyone else for joining us today, taking time out. It's been a pleasure to see you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Yes, thank
Dusty.
you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.